Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for The Leftovers Season 3, Episode 6, Certified. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of The Leftovers, so I have to start with a spoiler warning for The Leftovers up to Season 3, Episode 6. If you haven't seen up to this point, you may not want to watch this video, otherwise some things may be spoiled for you. So I wasn't sure at first how I thought about this episode. This is one of those episodes, the more I think about it, the more I like it. As at first, I wasn't too happy with this episode. The main issue I had with it is that it felt very disjointed, and the fact that it started off by skipping over a large period of time, I felt was a bit disorientating and felt like it kind of distanced me from the main plot and made me less interested in it. Yeah, I know that most of the time we skipped over, nothing much really important happened anyway, and anything relevant was explained in the episode, and so we didn't really need to see this missing time, but still I felt it had the effect of alienating me from the story overall. However, the more I thought about it, the more I thought this format of the episode actually made a lot of sense. With the opening with Lori arriving at Grace's ranch and meeting Kevin Sr. and then giving us in flashbacks the time she spent with Nora, as it was a great way to cut back and forth through the different storylines, with Lori being the common anchor. And of course, Lori's overall storyline was very powerful and helped define her character overall. I find with most Lori episodes, it tends to be more melancholy than the others, and I liken this to her season 2 episode. It still has that season 1 feel to it. The kind of dreary feel that season 1 had that isn't as present in the later seasons. In fact, it seemed to me that this episode had more musical callbacks to season 1 than any other episode this season has. And this certainly was a dreary episode. So upon further reflection, I did find this a very powerful episode. Not one of my favorites, but still very effective. So the theme of the episode was clearly suicide, as it begins and ends with an attempted suicide, but it does appear as though the second attempt was successful. And the song that played over the opening credits was a song about suicide, which did make that theme very clear. In fact, we got several mentions of suicide throughout the episode, such as Lori referring to the Radiation's people's machine as a suicide machine, and Nora making it clear that she didn't want to commit suicide, but it left with the impression that she would use the machine that is just as good as suicide. And Nora was accusing Matt of committing suicide by not seeking treatment for his cancer, and when Lori mentioned she was Judas, Michael mentions that Judas committed suicide. And of course, there's Kevin's plan to kill himself in order to go to the afterlife. And of course, Nora mentions the best way to commit suicide is by going scuba diving and causing an accident so no one would know it was suicide. And the episode ends with Lori going scuba diving, so we know what she's really doing. So this is all very interesting. So the episode begins with a flashback to 2 years after the departure, so roughly a year before season 1 took place, where we once again see the woman from the pilot episode of the entire series, where the very first scene we got was focused just on her and how her baby departed. So we viewed the departure through her eyes. She made a few more brief cameos in season 1, but other than that, we haven't really seen her. We actually get her backstory on how she tried to conceive for over 5 years and came to terms with the fact that she couldn't get pregnant, and then finally had a baby only to have it disappear in a departure. It makes her story even more tragic than it already was. And what's more powerful is that she asked Lori to tell her what to do, and Lori couldn't. And you could just tell how much this story affected Lori, as she lost her own unborn child in the departure. So she was just as lost as this woman was, and I think it was this moment that she was just pretending to know the answers, and she was pretending to be okay, and she finally had to admit that she had no idea what to do or what to say. So we saw how much this affected Laurie because she takes a bunch of pills and tries to kill herself. She even writes a suicide note, but as she lays down to die, she changes her mind and vomits up the pills. But the first thing she does once she's better is to put on white clothes and go out to the guilty remnant standing outside her office and ask them what to do. So in effect, we get the origin story of why Laurie joined the Guilty Remnant. I mean, we already knew she did so because of the loss of her unborn child, but here we find out it was actually an alternative to suicide, which is interesting. A lot of people love to give her shit about being in the Guilty Remnant. Matt just last week made a comment about her whistle, and in this episode, Nora mentions the mock-ups of those who departed that her and her pals put in her kitchen. And Jill, of course, was very harsh on her for abandoning her for the remnant. But when you learn it was actually an alternative to suicide, it does put an interesting twist on things. And of course, it's extremely relevant for this episode because it establishes her suicidal tendency. Now, there's been some speculation on who these guilty remnants standing outside her office were and who they were there for, and I actually think the answer was given to us in the show. When the young mother was talking to Laurie, she mentioned they were probably there to pick off her patients because they considered them easy pickings, and I think that's all there is to it. And when Laurie came out to them, they totally weren't expecting that, as they tend to follow around those who lost someone in the departure, and they probably had no idea of her losing her unborn child because that is not common knowledge. So I think they were actually quite surprised when Laurie came out to them because she was there. They were there to get the patients, but they ended up getting the doctor instead. But that's just my take on it. Either way, I think it's interesting to finally learn why she joined the remnant. It does make that decision a bit more understandable. So in the episode, we jump straight to Laurie arriving at the ranch and meeting with Kevin Sr., but in flashbacks, we see the time she spent with Nora. So what we can piece together throughout the episode of what happened once Laurie, Matt, John, and Michael arrived in Melbourne is that they went to the hotel Kevin and Nora were booked in at, and at this point, Kevin had already left, and so they just found Nora there. And as far as she knew, Kevin left to go to the airport, so John and Michael went to the airport to track him down, while Laurie and Matt stayed with Nora. No doubt Nora told them the story of the radiation people and why she was there, so they agreed to help her track these people down, and Laurie used her research skills that she acquired by conning people and in order to track these scientists down to the house that they were staying at. Meanwhile, John and Michael arrived at the airport to find Kevin wasn't there, and so they tried calling him, and this time he actually answered his phone and told them where he was and that he was with his father at some ranch, so John and Michael went out to join him. So that's everything that happened between episodes 5 and 6, and when I think about it, we didn't really need to see any of this, and it made a lot of sense to just skip over it and jump straight to a point that's more relevant to the story. But still, I found the way it started with Laurie arriving at the ranch and not really explaining any of this until later in the episode a bit disorientating at first, but upon further reflection, it doesn't bother me that much, but I do think it could have been handled a little bit better. But again, I loved the way that Nora and Kevin Sr. scenes were intercut together. It was actually reminiscent of Lost and how they used to do flashbacks running alongside the island storyline, where you have two storylines running parallel that sort of build off each other as they progress and sort of push forward the same emotional themes. So I actually thought that was handled really well, as the emotional journey and the build up in both storylines work in concert to be very effective, rather than had we got all of Nora's storyline first and then we got the Kevin Sr. stuff, it wouldn't have been as effective. So let me get into the Nora stuff first, as we start with them, stalking Dr. Becker and Dr. Eden, who are apparently lovers. And I kept looking for signs that they were frauds and wondering if, a sign would pop up that proves that they're just frauds and shows that they're just scamming people. But Yeah, I didn't really have any. And it's funny because Matt was apparently doing the same thing because he was like, oh, they don't look like physicists. To which Nora replied, well, what do physicists look like? And he responded by saying, oh, I thought they'd be wearing lab coats, which of course is ridiculous because physicists don't go around wearing lab coats wherever they go, especially when they're at home having wine. So it shows Matt was just reaching to uncover them as frauds, but Nora wasn't. It was also interesting getting the interactions between Nora and Laurie, as we never actually saw the two of them interact much on the show, certainly not in the first 2 seasons, and most of their interactions likely took place off screen during the gap of seasons 2 and 3, where she seemed perfectly fine with her ex-husband's new girlfriend. And I didn't get the impression that Nora held anything against Laurie, but she likes to goad people, like we saw her giving Matt and John shit about the book, and we see her goading Laurie about the scams that she runs with John and about the stunt with the replicas that she pulled with the Guilty Remnant. So that's just Nora being her cheeky self. But she seemed to take an extreme when she refused to give Laurie her lighter back. And again, I think she was just pushing her, but she obviously didn't know the sentimental value that Laurie had with the lighter. And Laurie, for her part, I think, could have done a better job at explaining that the lighter had sentimental value to her, but instead she just lost her shit and attacked Nora. It just goes to show how unstable Laurie actually is. But anyway, we did get some interesting information in this scene as we got more of an explanation as to why Laurie and John refused to claim that they were talking to those who departed, because apparently they tried doing it a couple of times and it never worked, and they had to stop after John was attacked. And Laurie said it was because people whose loved ones had departed didn't want closure, but that actually doesn't make sense to me, as I think those whose loved ones has departed would want closure more than those who had loved ones that died, because the departure was even more mysterious than death. But I suppose if John claimed that he was talking to them, that would mean that they were dead, and perhaps that's what pissed these people off. However, when Laurie told Nora these people didn't want closure, she replied by saying that she did. Now that statement I found a bit ironic, because it didn't seem like she wants closure, because just as Kevin pointed out, it seems she can never move past the fact that her children departed. But perhaps she can't, but she wants to, which is why she wants to go in that machine so badly, even if it does lead to her death. But I believe her when she said she was not simply suicidal, because if she was, she'd go scuba diving. But the fact she knew so much about how the best way to kill yourself was does tell me that she had considered it before. So they managed to track Dr. Eden and Dr. Becker to the machine, and Laurie asks Nora if she'll call the DSD to shut them down. But then Nora tells a story about when she and Matt were kids going to a baseball game shortly after the parents died, and having a beach ball being thrown around, which was so much fun until the usher came by and popped the ball and ruined the fun for everyone. So the metaphor was clear, as throwing the ball around was a moment of fun for her and her brother to forget about their parents' death and the pain they felt for it. And when it was done, it brought back the weight of her parents' death. And so she equates this machine of the loss of felt by those from the departure and lightening that loss. And if she were to shut it down, she'd be like the usher who ruined it for everyone who just wanted and escaped from their pain. But wait a second, I can't help but find this story a bit hypocritical coming from her after what she did to Tower Man, because she did exactly the same thing, because all those people that believed Tower Man departed, it made them feel better and it gave them an escape from their pain, but she didn't care. She wanted them to feel as miserable as she did. But perhaps she has changed since then and realized what she did and no longer wanted to be that person. She no longer wanted to be the usher. And I also really like Laurie's response to the story that somebody needs to be the usher, because if not, it'll be chaos. And so Matt decides to stay behind with Nora to be with family. And it's interesting, this massive change in Matt, who before was totally obsessed with Kevin and getting him back to Miracle, but it seems now he's completely let go and accepted whatever is going to happen is going to happen. And I think this has had a profound impact on Laurie. You can see it on her face in the scene how Nora is completely devoted to using the machine, which will likely lead to her death, and both her and Matt are at peace with this, and Matt thinks the world is coming to an end and he's okay with that. So this, I think, has had a profound effect on Laurie, and I do personally believe this was the moment she first decided to kill herself. So she then goes out to the ranch where Michael had called her and told her that they were there, and she hears the whole story about how Kevin Sr., John, and Michael all want Kevin to kill himself and journey to the afterlife. And she also meets Grace, the woman who killed a police officer and now wants to kill Kevin, so that she can talk to her dead kids. In fact, she mentions how each of them, John, Kevin Sr., and Grace, want something from Kevin dying, and they built him up as a savior figure. So here's my take on what she's thinking. I think that Laurie doesn't buy into anything that they're saying now for a second, and that her take on it is that Grace and John are so overcome with grief, and Kevin Sr. is just insane and painting himself as this messiah figure, as a man who's going to save the world, that they're all so desperate they turn to Kevin into a savior figure who could save them all, but what they're really doing is that they're simply going to kill Kevin. Laurie doesn't believe for a second that Kevin will come back. She's 100% convinced that he will die and that her husband is going to be one of the ones that kill him. So I think, this is furthering her decision to commit suicide. However, the reason why Laurie appears to go along with them and doesn't try to talk them out of it, I believe, goes right along with what she's been saying this whole time about when someone is delusional. You don't tell them that they're delusional, as that doesn't work. This was also indicated when Nora was telling her about the French man who launched a nuclear missile, who apparently did so because he thought a 7-headed monster was about to hatch that would end the world, so he was trying to kill it. And Nora asked Laurie what she would say to a guy like that, and her response was she'd say, "Don't miss." So basically, that she wouldn't try to talk him out of it. We got further backstory on how Kevin Sr. was institutionalized, that he went to Laurie and told her he was hearing voices, and she told him the voices were real, and then had him institutionalized. So obviously, she never tells anyone that she thinks is insane that they're insane. So Kevin Sr. could tell that that's what she was doing now from his experience, just humoring them, but she didn't actually believe for a second in their calls. However, there's another layer to this in her conversation with John, because John even mentions that he can tell that Kevin Sr. is insane, but he can't admit it to himself, because if he does, then he'd have to admit that he's insane as well. And he asks Laurie to tell him that he's insane, and says that if she does, then he'll give everything up, he'll go home with her and end it all. And interestingly enough, Laurie doesn't do that and tells him that he needs to see this through to the end. Now, does this mean that Laurie believes that he'll get Kevin to send a message to his daughter? No. I think she does this for several reasons. First of all, this kind of harpens back to what John and Laurie do for others, helping them find closure for the loved ones who have died. And she realizes that this is what John needs to do in order to find his closure. And if he doesn't do it, he'll never have closure. So she doesn't want to be the usher in this case and ruin it for John. And secondly, I think she had already decided to kill herself by this point, and she knew that she wasn't going back with John to live happily ever after. So, a couple more observations about these scenes. First of all, we learn Kevin Sr.'s true plan, and that it was a bit different than what I suspected, as I thought he had abandoned his quest to save the world by singing, but apparently not. He still thinks that's what he needs to do in order to save the world, but he's convinced he needs Kevin's help in order to do it, because Kevin has to go into the afterlife and get the song from Christopher Sunday that he needs to sing in order to save the world. So it does seem like that would be Kevin's primary mission in the afterlife. But he also needs to give Evie John's message, and also needs to ask Grace's children where they put their shoes. Another observation is there was a scene in episode 3 where Kevin Sr. first wakes up in Grace's house and goes outside to find a bunch of people building a boat. Now, there was a lot of speculation that these people were the ghosts of Grace's dead children, but I was actually never on board with this theory, which is why I never brought this up before. And it turns out that it has been confirmed that that is not the case, as John tells Laurie that they are, in fact, the cousins of one of Grace's children that died, that were building this boat as a memorial to him because he loved boats. In fact, John mentions this to explain that Kevin Sr. incorporated this into his own fantasy to further prove that he's probably insane. So I wasn't too surprised this was the case, but there's nothing wrong with coming up with crazy theories, especially when where this show is concerned. So Michael's part in this is pretty clear, as he obviously has doubts about what they're doing, as he was the one who called Laurie and told her where to go. So it seems apparent to me that he was hoping that she would stop this madness, and that he was a bit disappointed when she didn't. When Kevin Sr. asked him what apostle he wanted to be, he said pass. So it's very clear at this point that he was not on board with what they were doing. But it is interesting, when Kevin Sr. was passing around the roles for the apostles, he said Laurie was doubting Thomas, but I actually think that Michael is doubting Thomas, and Laurie, as she said, is playing the role of Judas, because Thomas did eventually come to believe in the resurrection, as I believe Michael will in this case, but Judas, as they pointed out, simply betrayed them and then killed himself. So that's clearly the role that they're giving to Laurie. It was interesting how she fed them all the dog's pills to knock them out. It seems a bit extreme, but I suppose at this point she really didn't have much to lose, and she mainly just wanted to say goodbye to Kevin. I did find it interesting that it wasn't John, her husband, that she felt the most important need to talk to before she died. It was Kevin. And I think she cared about John, but she didn't really feel as connected to him as she did with Kevin, possibly because she didn't have as much history with him. And I think John was just a band-aid to give her life meaning in its current form, but I got the impression that the relationship wasn't quite as deep, and I'm sure Laurie came to this conclusion as well after learning John had been hiding how he felt about his daughter from her, and that he was willing to kill Kevin in order to try to feel closer to his dead daughter. So her conversation with Kevin was really interesting, as they were basically not even talking about Kevin's impending death, and instead were just reminiscing about old times, which led to a confession off, where, they were just confessing a bunch of things that they hadn't told each other, which led to Laurie finally telling Kevin about the unborn child she lost during the departure. And I think this was important for her to finally tell him the truth, and I'm sure he can infer that this had a lot to do with her joining the guilty remnant. But then they started talking about his impending death, where Laurie asks if he's feeling scared about dying, to which he answers with a stern no, and he talks about how nice the time he spent in the afterlife was, and she said that she's not scared either then. So in the context of this conversation, it appears that she's saying she's not scared for Kevin, but what she's really saying is she's not scared of her own impending suicide either. In fact, I believe Kevin's certainty and fearlessness is what pushed her over the edge to decide to do it, because like Nora, Kevin was totally at peace with what Lori was certain would be a suicide. Because in Lori's mind, there is no possibility of Kevin coming back. So what Kevin is talking about is killing himself, plain and simple, and he's okay with it, which makes her okay with her own death as well. And of course, the biggest sign that she plans on killing herself is that once she leaves, she doesn't take the lighter that Jill gave her. Even when Kevin offers it to her and Kevin asks her if Nora is gone, to which she responds, "We're all gone," which I think is the most telling, because in her mind, Kevin is about to kill himself, and his own father and her husband and stepson are going to help him do it. Nora is going to kill herself, and her brother is going to help her do it. So as far as she's concerned, there's no reason for her to be there anymore, and she has nothing left to live for. The big question I have is, after Lori said, "We're all gone," is, did Kevin know what she was going to do? Because the way he said goodbye to her almost seemed like he did, but who knows. So then we get a big scene where she goes scuba diving, and it's very clear to me that this is her suicide scene. I'd be totally shocked if it's revealed that she's still alive after this episode. In fact, if we see Lori again this season, I suspect it would be in the afterlife. So she gets a call from Jill, who asks her a simple question about something, a video that she used to watch as a kid. And I don't think this gave her trepidation on what she was about to do. On the contrary, I think it gave her validation, as it confirmed to her that her kids were okay and that they were going to be okay without her. She said to Kevin earlier that the best thing that they've ever done was raising those two kids. So I believe she believes that her job is accomplished and there's no reason for her to be there anymore. And Nora spelled out so completely for her the perfect scuba diving scenario was that her children and her husband wouldn't know that she killed herself, and so they would be free of guilt and they would just see it as an accident, and thus they would have closure. Of course, Nora would know, and Matt would know, because he was there, because she laid out the whole situation very clear to her. And of course, John might find it a bit suspicious that she'd sedated him, and the next thing he knows, she's dead. And Jill and Tommy might be suspicious of why she lied to them about being in Australia. And the others might wonder why she all of a sudden decided to go scuba diving on the 7th anniversary of the departure. But of all of this, this was overall a absolutely powerful ending. As much like Kevin and Nora, Lori seemed totally at peace with the fact that she was about to die. So my rating for Certified out of 10 is a 9 excellent. Although I found the time jump a bit disorientating at first, this was an absolutely powerful episode, one of the most powerful episodes this show has ever done. It helped push the story forward with what Kevin and Nora were up to, but mainly gave us some real closure in Lori's storyline while diving really deep into her character, which explains more of her overall arc over the entire show. And Amy Bremenman gave an absolutely spectacular performance in this episode that absolutely sold it, because so much of this episode was portrayed between the lines through subtlety, and it was just pulled off so amazingly well and reminded me why I consider The Leftovers one of the greatest shows of all time. So that's it for my review of Certified. Be sure to check back here every week as I cover the final 2 episodes of The Leftovers. Also be sure to check out my channel for many more videos on other shows like Game of Thrones, Star Trek, Better Call Saul, The 100, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.